Rory Nicholas, welcome on the show. So, we're going to talk about systems thinking, and I'll hand it right over to you.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about not systems thinking. So, one of the ways I initiated this discussion between us, Sean, was to say that you talk quite a lot about systems thinking, and I'm sufficiently intimidated by your engineering background not to say you're talking nonsense, but I operate in a arena in which people are constantly talking about systems thinking. And we maybe as we go on, we can get into a little bit more about what they mean by that. But I think I've got to the stage where, at least in my field, when I hear people talk about systems thinking, I reach for my gun, not literally. Uh, I think it's bullshit. Now, um, I think Rory occasionally, I don't want this to be an attack on Rory, but occasionally Rory, these words will come out of his lips about systems, and I'm hoping I might persuade him that they shouldn't, but I don't mind occasionally people mentioning it. What I mind is them using this expression systems thinking as if they have come up to some threshold of complexity and somehow penetrated through it. And that's kind of an okay metaphor for some of the stuff out of the Santa Fe Institute and so on. But I'm talking about people who say that they're looking at a program to reduce homelessness, and they're looking through a systems lens. Well, bullshit. You're not, or if you are looking through a systems lens, the thing that the programs that you're critiquing are also looking through systems lenses. We're talking about whether the way you're looking at it is a good way to look at it or a bad way to look at it. And that's maybe where I'll end my introduction to my provocation.
Rory, what do you
Ooh.
think?
I'm going to be I'm going to be a little more indulgent, actually, and for several reasons. Okay, I suppose that complexity has attributes that simple Newtonian problems don't. Okay, and at least if you use the word.
No.
Okay,
Let me hop
at
in for a
least if,
sec. Let me hop in for a
okay,
sec. But maybe
okay,
I should do this
go
later.
on.
But
Go on.
look, you know about Newton. Newton proposed that the world was a system. He was a systems thinker, wasn't he? Now, you can then argue about whether he had the right systems, whether there were more things in heaven and earth than were dreamt of in his system. But this is my point, that the Newtonian system was a piece of systems thinking. It's all in the words.
Yes, I suppose I was talking in a sense where you're talking about levels of complexity.
Yeah.
And Newton himself said, "What is it? I can predict the movements of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people."
Yeah.
So there are levels which are entirely calculable and predictable. Okay, and which are possessed of a kind of proportionality. And you might also argue there are mechanical systems. Admittedly, they are systems, but they're very simple systems. They're not complex systems, where the optimization of the parts also brings about the optimization of the whole, and where to intervene in the system, you intervene in the most obvious way. Okay? Now, I agree with you that often this is used. You're absolutely right, because any economic model is a system.
Yeah, that's right.
This is absolutely true. However crude and simplistic it may be, it still can be described as a system. And that what we're really talking about is different levels of complexity, and the very different attributes that those different levels of complexity would have in terms of how you can intervene, how you can predict, and what you need to do in order to try and improve them. But someone who said, I suppose, what they're really saying when they say I'm going to look at the problem of homelessness through a systems lens is saying I'm going to cast the net a bit wider in looking for both cause and effect. And so, you could look at it very simply through the lens of people don't have a home, we'll give them a place to live, which may or may not work, and surprisingly often doesn't, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Because particularly if you have a homeless shelter which doesn't allow drugs and alcohol, the people won't go there, or they'll go there and very rapidly get kicked out. And you could say, well, how did these people become homeless in the first place? Which is at least a wider inquiry. Which, okay, there's always that famous, inverted commas, trade-off between explore and exploit, which I don't think is really a trade-off. I think they're two parts of the same whole. But nonetheless, someone who's using that phrase is perhaps to be commended, I think, even if they're misusing the phrase, because at least they're making an effort to go one level deeper.
So, okay. So
I'm being very indulgent.
No, that's fine. I mean, this is a good question. What's my beef? I can't think of anything sillier than me saying, oh, they shouldn't use that term, they should use another term. I'm saying that they're giving themselves airs. I'm saying that they're putting themselves over as having performed this remarkable trick of being holistic, and in many cases they're actually not being very indulgent to the system that they come into contact with, that the system that they're critiquing. They're not asking, for instance, am I the first person who's ever thought of asking homeless people how they see it? Am I the first person to think of involving them in the process of governing this business? Because if they ask that, I think they'll come to somewhat different conclusions. They'll realise that, lots of the sort of basic things that are taught in social work at university, this is all extremely basic. Now, it is possible that it's not being done. And then one might become curious about why it wasn't being done. And perhaps the reason it's not being done is not because we need some new consultants to point out that this is a system that we should attempt to look at in a holistic way. Perhaps it's not being done. Perhaps not doing the obvious is a sign of the disparate nature of power in this system. The fact that the homeless aren't really getting, we're not really finding much out about the homeless, that the experience from the point of view of homelessness is, I won't say at the centre of it's at the centre of the program along with a bunch of other things. It's not the only thing that is guiding the program. It's a useful thing to say, let's do that. It's not, I think this word systems again is misleading, because systems are about things, and the problem is that this is about people. It's about governance, it's about collective action, not just a system that is being worked upon. So that's a...
Well, it's emphatically true that anything involving people has to acknowledge phenomenology to an extent.
Yeah.
Because perception is part of the system, communication is part of the system.
You could argue part of the system.
You could certainly argue, and there's a wonderful book. You I think introduced me to it, the Dan Davis book, which is called The Unaccountability Machine.
Great book.
And his great call for the resurrection of cybernetics.
Yeah.
Is partly an argument to the fact that effectively economics attempted to make, and actually I would argue a lot of business has attempted to make the flow of money the only thing you have to quantify and measure in optimizing an organization, when the flow of information, for example, is undoubtedly more important, and that emphatically involves perception as well as just simple data being communicated. So, and I think you also have to get anthropological if you're to understand a business as well. In other words, not all human things scale perfectly. Groups of 10 and groups of maybe 150, if you believe Robin Dunbar, have attributes which don't replicate if you make things bigger. Eleanor Ostrom was also onto that whole question, of what you centralise and what you localise. I don't know what Dan's opinion of Ostrom is, but I imagine he'd be a pretty big fan. So what I think is interesting, though, is that if the person is saying from the lens of system thinking, and this is where I get conservative, perhaps unexpectedly, from the point of view of saying, let's redesign a new system. I'd be cautious, because you may not fully understand how the old system works and how you might need to intervene in it to improve it. On the other hand, creativity is often about an oblique solution. One thing I do notice, which I think is important, is that there is what you might call performative problem solving, where you deliberately try and intervene in a problem in the most direct and obvious way possible, as a way of signalling that you care about the problem or that you're trying to solve the problem. Okay, someone who is, on the other hand, being sincere will often look for oblique, tangential, or indeed sort of butterfly effect interventions. Now, those may be better at solving the real problem, but they're not very good at signalling that you care about the problem. Now, you could argue that broken windows theory is, one example of that, which is that it seems it's much better to call for, tougher sentencing or something as a way of reducing crime in a neighbourhood, or more policing. Whereas, going around, effectively dealing with trivial crime, or in some cases improving the environment by, in one experiment we did, painting shop shutters so they looked effectively less as a kind of, tacit signal of criminality. The oblique solution often doesn't score the headlines. And of course, the worst form of that in government is we have allocated a budget of X towards this as proof that you care, without any particular thought about how that budget will be spent. So, I suppose I'm always sympathetic in people who are at least acknowledging that the solution is complex, because most people don't, in fact. But in fact, the most boring explanation is lack of funding.
So what I do, see, the one promising direction to take the case is to take your point about performativity more seriously and say, why don't we look at the way in which performing the solution is crowding out the solution? That's really what you're saying. And so that's not system thinking particularly. That's bug fixing. That's noticing. No, it's not system. I mean, everything's systems thinking. If you're going to call that systems thinking, it's very different to. It's got nothing to do with the Santa Fe Institute. It's got nothing to do with modelling complexity or any of that. It's saying, hang on a minute. You used the word phenomenology. It's understanding this as a phenomenon, to understanding the process by which this group of people home in on a problem and try and solve it. And then you say, well, hang on a minute. You people, if you're really honest with yourselves, you're putting your own performance, you're making your own performance a too big a part of this. You kind of need to do a bit of Buddhism on yourself. Somehow get yourself out of the scene and let the phenomena speak more. Don't you think?
To be honest, it's worth noting that in a lot of settings, and this is sometimes driven by, this is often driven actually by silos in business. you get people who are entirely fixated on one metric, to the exclusion of consideration of how this may have second order effects. And consequently, one thing that systems thinking, I agree it's a pretty vague term, and by the way, how broad do you want to go, etc. Do we go to the Gaia hypothesis straight? Every time we have a small problem in business, do we have to consider the Gaia hypothesis? Okay, that would get a bit impossible. But if it means simply, if you say the use of it is simply not basically what systems thinking means when it's used casually, is not crude, obvious pursuit of a single attractive metric on the assumption that everything will therefore proportionately improve, okay, then maybe what we should do is, when people say systems thinking, they're really saying we're not going to practice the most obvious form of thinking here, which is, we're not going to pretend this is an entirely simple system where the optimization of the parts will lead to the optimization of the whole, and where the performance of an obvious action will necessarily be good. And we will accept one quality of complex systems, which is that sometimes, for example, sometimes you actually make the whole system faster by making parts of it slower. I mean, that's a deeply counterintuitive thing. And if what you're saying by this is we're simply opening the door to the non-obvious or the counterintuitive, or even better still, you're using it as an admission of honest ignorance. Okay, so if you go, I think we're going to have to look at this through a systems lens. And what you really mean by that is we don't fully know what's going on, and doing the obvious thing may not be the best thing to do. Then it's a form of progress. It's what I'm saying is it's inverted. Okay, if you invert it in the kind of Charlie Munger way, where I always say that McDonald's isn't the most successful restaurant in the world because it's really good. It's the most successful restaurant because it's really good at not being bad. Okay, then I would regard anybody as saying systems, okay, as at least having acknowledged the fact that the world isn't black and white, and that there is a degree of complexity, and also, even more important still, acknowledging what you don't know. So, I mean, I think that Daniel Kahneman phrase, "Wizziati," what you see is all there is undoubtedly a human bias, which is you have the metrics and the data you happen to have to hand, you optimize for those, and you walk away happy. Okay, that happens a lot. So anybody who's simply going, maybe we don't know everything here that we need to know, or we haven't considered all the factors we need to consider. Okay, I agree with you. Their use of language is imprecise, but it's kind of better than nothing. Okay.
Well, on that subject, are you saying, Nicholas, that there's a lot of people going round? Is your main beef here that there's a lot of people going round saying, "Oh, let's take a systems thinking approach," and they're not taking a systems thinking approach the way Rory's describing it, and they're not taking a systems thinking approach the way you would describe it, in terms of you have different avenues to look at things and different tools. Is that your primary beef?
My beef is that they're bullshitting, and my beef is that they're getting themselves further away from describing the nature of what they're doing if they're successful at solving problems, and the nature of what a good way to solve problems is. So I think, to get back to something we spoke about a little bit earlier, I think the essence of trying to solve problems is to notice things, to wonder about things, in terms of what Rory was saying earlier, certainly to acknowledge one's own ignorance. But to, I guess that there are systems that are incredibly stupid and dumb, but most systems that we critique are not really like that. They're administered by people who've got quite a lot of experience with the thing that they're dealing with. They're thoughtful enough, And what we're going to do if we want to change something is we're going to say we understand enough about this to identify some weaknesses in it and to identify some new approaches and to then test them and all that kind of stuff. It's in other words, that's not really, it's only systems thinking in the very, very tame sense that Rory was outlining earlier. What it is it's bug fixing. It's looking for problems and trying to solve them. It's trying to notice things that we might not have noticed before. Partly fueled by humility, by the knowledge of how little we know. And I just think that's a much more promising way to understand what it is that we're trying to do. Because we're very, very rarely in a situation where, let's say, Rory used the term butterfly effect. It's true that systems of all kinds have butterfly effects, including Newton's systems. You know, the three body problem.
Three body problem.
Yeah, if you have three heavenly bodies, celestial bodies, I love those terms, rotating each other, then you get butterfly effects all over the place. Now, it's kind of in the nature of a butterfly effect that you can't manage using a butterfly effect. So again, another point that I'm making here is that this word systems thinking sort of turns up at the end. If you're trying to interact with a three-body, with three interplanetary, three celestial bodies, you might be able to do it. You might be able to do some things, but it's very hard. Anyway, you go.
You've actually written one of my favourite ever papers, which I think actually bears on this problem, which is your idea that the worst thing that economics did for the world is teaching people the idea of trade-offs.
Yeah, we're teaching them that it's axiomatic. Exactly.
That it's axiomatic that there is a trade-off between two things.
That's right.
And so, for example...
Cost and quality. Cost and quality.
Cost and quality would be. I mean, interestingly, Southwest Airlines, you would always assume that there's a kind of a trade-off between high price and high customer service.
Yeah.
And Southwest Airlines actually.
I tell my wife it's not true, but she tells me you get what you pay for. Anyway, you go on.
I mean. Interestingly, I think your great point was Toyota, wasn't it? Which had a very, very low level of fault-finding inspection because they resolved the apparent trade-off by building quality control into the manufacturing process,
as you put it earlier,
rather than putting it at the end.
As you put it earlier, they understood that to make things faster and better, you make some things slower and worse, or that is more expensive. But the great factoid that shows this is that when I first learned about this system in the Australian car market, there were two cars that had the best build quality in Australia, which had a technical measurement of errors per car, and they were the Mercedes-Benz 350 SLE and the Toyota Corolla, and they achieved it in diametrically opposite ways. The 350 SLE had a sort of a team of inspectors, and the Toyota Corolla had no inspectors. They'd built the process of inspection into the process of performing any function at all.
And I think famously in Japanese car manufacturing, anybody on the line could stop the production line.
They
had ropes that they
marvelous.
Could pull,
you see, this is another marvelous story. Now you've got me going. So there is this thing called the andon cord, and it's true that if something goes wrong, the andon cord is pulled. Now the thing is, the Americans, when it finally became impossible for the Americans to deny the extraordinary productivity miracle that was going on at Toyota, they sent their engineers out. I can show you the graphs for the 15 years while Toyota tripled their labor productivity, and the Americans did nothing. And then eventually they go, oh, we better do something. And what they did is they sent their engineers out to Nagoya, Toyota City, and you may have heard of Edwards Deming, who was he was American, ironically. American jazz player and statistical control guy. And he sort of like Bill Clinton without the statistical control. And anyway, he was a funny guy. And they turn up and he says, the Americans come, they bring their notebooks, they walk around the factory, they ask questions, they write it all down, and they go home and they try to copy us. But they don't know what to copy. And what they didn't know was that the Toyota production system is a sort of socio-technical system which is built on the respect and the self-respect of the people on the line. It doesn't mean that people higher above them get paid more, even though they get paid far lower multiples than in the United States. But this is a system, a bit like a hospital in a way, where the doctors are very important in a hospital, and they're more in a good hospital. They're got a lot more. They're paid a great deal of respect, and they're given a great deal of support. And when the Americans went back to America, they installed andon cords, and they said to the workers, we know about this system. We're so into high quality that if it's not perfect, pull the andon cord. And of course, the workers aren't mad, and they don't want chaos, and they want to be able to come back the next day. And so they don't pull the andon cord. And eventually they get bullied into someone pulls the andon cord. And of course, there is complete chaos. And they get rid of the andon cords because they don't know what to copy. Now, I guess to get back to the original point, not that I'm entirely happy to ditch it, but to get back to the original point, I think it's kind of, in the end, Toyota ends up with a system, and you can talk about systems thinking if you like. They didn't really get there with systems thinking. They got there by noticing, innovating, stabilizing the innovation so that can be built into the next innovation, connecting up the innovations, inviting people at the bottom of this process to come up with their ideas, whether they're workers on the line or suppliers. So that's how they did it. They didn't do it with someone walking in saying, "I've got a new system and let's do it."
Is that not though? Nicholas, is that not, though, that the Americans came and didn't take a proper, genuine systems thinking approach to what they were seeing? They never asked why.
Are there systems
they
thinkers?
They took the what and never asked the why. Is
well,
that not what, why it failed?
No, because the way I want to describe that is that the Americans weren't humble enough. Not that the Americans weren't systems thinkers. They were both systems thinkers. But both of them know that a car factory is phenomenally complicated. They know that. And they know that there are systems within systems. But
would Rory not say, though, that what they took was the technical bit of the system and ignored the socio bit of the system? That's the... Is that not the...
That also happens in politics, where I think you copy institutions. And you copy the part of the institution. Rather like if you try... and there's a wonderful guy who's written a book on the political mind. I'll try and dig out his name in a second. He emailed me a couple of days ago, and he made the point that that you try and impose on Afghanistan what you might call American systems of government, with no clue about the sort of systems of patronage that are already in place, etc. In other cultures, and you're copying simply the visible part of something, without any attempt to understand. And of course, probably the culture in a Detroit car factory was not the same as in a Nagoya car factory for all kinds of reasons. I would argue, by the way, that I think the shareholder value movement is an absolute cultural catastrophe, because it's one of these things that there are a lot of things that make perfect sense, but they're actually stupid.
Yeah.
In reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would argue that the shareholder value
Totally
movement
agree.
is an example like that.
Yeah.
And is that because
Because
it
in any
collapses everything
organisation-
to money? Is that
It reduces everything to money. It also creates, in any business, I would argue, in any non-financial business, there are a lot of people who are principally motivated by doing a good job.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I would argue that if you look at human psychology, serving the customer, or in the case of an advertising agency, the client, is something which is kind of innate, that you want to do a good job for somebody else.
Yep.
Whom you know.
Yep.
That's an innate motivation. Or if you're a doctor, the urge to care. Okay, that's tapping into a fairly basic human, and also reputation, by the way. Okay, so all of those things actually align fairly well with our evolved psychology. On the other hand, I don't get up in the morning attempting to enrich the state of Wisconsin DMV pension fund, which is probably, I don't know, it might own 5% of my employer.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I just don't care that much about the long-term welfare of Wisconsin
Shocking.
DMV employees
Shocking.
for it to actually motivate me. Okay. Now, what then happens is you get a misalignment by the people at the top who are heavily bonused by shareholder value. And so you get this weird cadre at the top who are motivated because they're effectively mercenaries.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay, right. At the top. And because they realise their interests are completely misaligned with the people in the hospital or the advertising agency, they therefore have to adopt a command and control mentality towards their employees. And so you end up with an organisation that has no volunteers. It has mercenaries at the top and conscripts at the bottom, effectively.
Yep.
And the most extreme case of this is in the great Roger L. Martin, who you must know, the Canadian business guru, who actually sat on the board of a hospital. And the chairman of the hospital board, or the person who ran the hospital, had started as a neonatal nurse. Okay. And at some point, someone suggested it might be beneficial to her if she were actually bonused on reducing the rate of infant mortality. Okay, that it would somehow motivate her far more to save the life of a young child. And her response was, I've spent 35 years of my entire life trying to reduce infant mortality.
Yeah.
Okay, the idea that I was only really doing it half-heartedly, and now you've come along and said it's 10 grand for... 10 grand per kid.
Yeah.
I'm suddenly discovering this new level of motivation.
Yeah.
Is actually, it's not only irrelevant, it's actually profoundly demotivating.
Exactly.
In fact, because
exactly.
it takes something that's intrinsic
Yeah.
and tries to make it extrinsic.
So all around the Toyota factories that I looked at in 1983, long time ago now, are these big signs saying people come to work every day to do a good day's work, not a bad day's work. This is completely fundamental to the psychology. And no one had ever thought to put signs like that up. And if they had put them up, the other problem is if they had put them up, they wouldn't have meant them. They would have put them up because that was a management fad, like the Andon court.
Yes, absolutely. No, so in a sense, I'll forgive anybody saying systems thinking, complexity. I mean, there are words you can't use in business very easily. Like, the only approach to this is sort of Darwinian. It's just not. It's and business is massively constrained by kind of argot and language.
Yeah, well, and government.
So,
and government. Within
yeah,
bureaucracy.
and government is hugely constrained within that.
Yeah.
And so what I think often happens in business is people use completely the famous phrase, of course, is quantum leap. Whereas, of course, a quantum means an immensely small quantity of something.
Well, not if you're an electron.
Ah, true. Yes. Okay. Fair point. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, if you're an electron, that's equivalent to the hyperspace. button
exactly.
in- what was it? Defender. That
Galactic.
computer game.
Galactic.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. But I mean, in some ways, I'm always quite indulgent. I mean, when I made my point at the beginning that I think cops are better scientists than scientists are, what I mean by that is that, first of all, the first question a cop will ask if there's some murder committed, because police work, Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle wrote about this, it involves reasoning backwards, or it involves a form of kind of, the only way you could describe it, I think, is abductive inference, okay? And unlike deduction or induction, it does involve an element of imagination, some leap of perception.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
right? And in a lot of business environments or governmental environments, those aren't allowed. Everything has to proceed from something else. But what cops will do is, if there's a crime committed, they ask, I think, a brilliant question. They'll go door to door and they'll ask, did anybody notice anything unusual between the hours of 8
I think
and
that's a great
11
question.
p.m.?
Yeah.
Now, it's a totally open-minded question.
Yeah.
Okay. It will almost certainly bring back some totally irrelevant information.
That's phenomenology.
And in amongst it,
that's phenomenology for you.
In amongst it, someone will say a man in a white van, because it's always a man in a white van for some reason. A man in a white van, drove past 4 times.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now that has no evidential value, right? You can't imprison someone, okay, for 15 years for driving a white van in a funny way. Although the rates of crime against children would probably decrease if you did, but nonetheless, you can't do it, okay? But it doesn't tell them anything except here's something worthy of further investigation.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't think the scientific community during COVID did that. I think they had this, suddenly this phrase appeared called the science.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the science was the body of peer-reviewed medical information about coronaviruses, which are mostly transmitted by fomites. In other words, they're by contact, by touch. But the point about this coronavirus is it was novel. Okay. Right. And consequently, you can't assume that the body of scientific peer-reviewed evidence is sufficient to help you understand what to do with this damn thing. Okay? And the correct question should have been, did anybody notice anything unusual? Now, I was doing detective work of my own, which is, I've got a friend, brilliant doctor who's a nephrologist in Canada, and she told us that in the early days of COVID, when they got something delivered from Amazon, they basically put it in the garage for 4 days, and then they bring it in and unwrap it because they were worried about contact. And after about 2 weeks or 3 weeks of doing this, I said to my wife, have there been any stories on the news about postmen getting really ill?
Yeah.
She said, no.
Yeah.
Have people in postal sorting offices had, extreme levels of COVID?
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can stop doing that.
So
Now, at that point, I went and bought a bloody Philips air filter, an air purifier,
clever
with a
you.
HEPA filter.
Here you are. You've got the
On the assumption that the bloody thing was airborne.
Yeah.
Right. Also, if I'm being a bit of a shit, on the assumption that if I got lucky, I could sell the bloody air filter for $5,000 on eBay. But by the way, I then got into a huge argument with people because they said HEPA filters don't remove all viruses from the air. To which I replied, well, A, there's a NASA paper which says they actually remove particles far smaller than they're actually designed for. B, viruses don't float around in the air as viruses. They float around in particles of, quite large particles.
C, some particles are better than getting rid of some particles is better than getting rid of none. See,
what's not to like
I'm much more going for the old jugular. This sort of thing happened constantly during COVID.
And they believed that they got this delusional belief that you couldn't have airborne transmission in particles larger than, which was something to do with tuberculosis, I think, infection. That there's a particular disease, airborne disease, where it has to infect the lower alveoli and can only do that if it's on very small particles. Okay? And someone derived from that the assumption that particles larger than 5 microns can't be airborne. To which I said, if only more doctors smoked. We always get on packets of cigarettes. Most doctors don't smoke. Now, all you've got to do to prove that's bollocks is to smoke a cigarette. Because when you smoke a cigarette, massive particles, I mean, they are enormous, actually, float through the air and hover around in the atmosphere for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So what I was saying is that the great thing with the cops is they start off from 2 assumptions. One, people are lying to us, not necessarily deliberately. I mean, but sometimes intentionally, which is also very useful in market research. You cannot take at face value everything everybody says. Okay, but they also start off from the very honest assumption that we don't know everything we need to know, and finding it out is going to be difficult because there are people who are trying to stop us knowing what we need to know. And then eventually you get to the evidential phase. That's different. Now, what I think science does is it makes a hero of the evidential phase without really talking about the investigative phase. And there is a podcast about this called Night Science, and it's by some New York scientists who argue, look, yes, we always talk about scientific papers and what happens when something's proved, but the early stages of science, which they call night science, are basically a load of people in the lab kind of dicking around, okay, talking shit with each other until someone stumbles on something interesting. And better still, the something interesting stumbles into the mind, a prepared mind of someone who can spot either the significance or the implications or the possibilities. But I think there's something wonderful. There is something wonderful about, simple acknowledgements that the world isn't simple. And also the readiness, as you said, to abandon the idea of the trade-off, which permeates all business thinking. As you said, there's a trade-off between price and quality, etc., etc. Is undoubtedly it's very, very common in government, which is the standard narrative in government is that things are underfunded, which is why they're underperforming.
Yeah, and another standard narrative in government is that. Yeah, that you can't. That things cost money, and lots of things don't cost money. Quality on the Corolla saved a lot of money, and there's a deep series of pathologies there. What I was going to say to Sean was that I think I should have got Rory to make my case right at the beginning, because the story of the policeman is a perfect example of someone who unpicks a diagnosis that's wrong, gets to a diagnosis that is right, and doesn't do it by saying, "Oh, we've got to do system thinking here." They do it by saying we've got to look at this in different ways.
That is a lovely segue, because I was going to throw a hypothesis at you both. Which is, from my perspective, I don't know how different your positions really are, but it seems to me that what you're really, quite rightfully angry about, Nicholas, is people who throw around the idea of, we'll take a systems thinking approach, which interestingly feels to me like it harks a little bit back to Rory's earlier comment that there's a difference between trying to solve the problem and, overtly signalling that you're solving the problem. That's saying, we're taking a systems thinking approach, a way of overtly signaling to say, we're putting much more thought into this than we would in a simple way. But then what they're kind of doing is they're not using any of the techniques that Rory's talking about. They're actually using and I know you really get upset when I say linear thinking, but they're kind of just stitching everything together. They're saying, now we've got a system
That's
view.
right.
And because we have a system view, we know what to do.
Yeah, totally.
I'd be very uncomfortable.
It's a bait and switch trick. It's a bait and switch trick. It's a bait and switch trick. You go, Rory. I'll just heckle.
As a metaphor for saying, let's try and reframe this, which I think is a genuine.
I totally agree.
I think Donella Meadows, in her 12 Ways to Intervene in a System, I think number one is effectively, what is it? It's a redefinition or a reframing of what the purpose of the system is.
Yep.
Okay. So in other words, if you stop seeing a lake as a source of water supply or whatever, and you start seeing it as an amenity, you know, that the capacity to reframe, okay, is, I think, the highest thing in Donella Meadows, the late Donella Meadows hierarchy of, you know, ways to intervene in a system. The other interesting thing, by the way, is I think that I don't think there's a process for solving these problems. I think there are checklists.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a process.
And I think there are tools, and there's thinking models to help you reframe.
There are tools. Now, the biggest lie in advertising, which we have to continually propagate, is that there's a process to producing a great advertisement. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the reason we have to pretend there's a process is because there are people called procurement people who demand to know what we're doing at every single stage of the game.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so we have to pretend there's a process. Now, a wonderful advertising guy called Paul Feldwick wrote the actual honest. It's rather like the honest, you know. I mean, undoubtedly, if you'd allowed him the chance, Fleming would have rewritten the discovery of penicillin as though it were what he intended all the way along.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. And he would have gone,
and
in another time he would have gone and got a patent too. It was a different time.
Yeah. By the way, I think the British should demand reparations from everybody else, because we gave away penicillin, and I'm not kidding. Chain, I think, wanted to make money out of it. But the other two, I'm not making this up, thought it would be deeply immoral to seek to profit from... So I actually met, you know, it was Heatley. Florey, Chain and Heatley were the three people who actually worked out how to make penicillin after Fleming had discovered it. Yeah. Heatley didn't get a Nobel Prize. I met his daughter once, and she lived... From what I remember, she lived in a pretty nice cottage in Oxfordshire. And I do remember thinking... Actually, you should be on a fucking super yacht, you know, at the Monaco Grand Prix.
Well, look, you're talking to the seventh cousin. I'm reliably informed by Genie.com. You're talking to the seventh cousin of Rosalind Franklin. So there's a few reparations I'm going to be asking for.
I've got a good one there, which is when I was about 21, I inherited £1,000 from a great aunt who died. And the £1,000 effectively came from the investments of her husband, who had spent his whole life investing a modest but sufficient amount of money to live on that he'd inherited from his father. His father had invented the caterpillar track on the eve of World War One in the UK, a man called Roberts, by the way. And as a family, we always thought this was slight mythology, and then my father actually researched it and found it was true. He sold the patent for the caterpillar track to a company which was called, I think, the California Tractor Company. I thought, oh well, you know, never mind. I only got £1,000, but it looks like the California Tractor Company never really went anywhere until I learned later Caterpillar. They rebranded themselves as Caterpillar.
Yeah. There you go.
Anyway, I got a grand out of it. So,
That's good.
you know, swings and roundabouts.
That's good. Now, Sean, you're going to have to try and, you know, make...
By the way, on intellectual property...
No, you're not.
Can I have a rant on intellectual property?
Yeah.
The Nat Show is called The Nat Show because it's named after a man called Nacho, who invented it by accident. Okay?
By accident.
Nacho is short for Ignacio, and he was called Ignacio something or other. He ran a cafe in Mexico, just south of Eagle Pass, Texas. 5 wives of USAF pilots who are based at Eagle Pass go across the border for the day. He's run out of food. He rigs up these. He's going, all I've got are these kind of tortillas, and I've got a bit of salsa and a bit of avocado, okay, and a few jalapenos. That's all I've got left. Look, I'll just bash this in the oven. Yeah. And they called them nachos chips. Okay. Yeah. Now, the guy died in like 1968 or 1973. Okay. But if now he made nothing, right? Meanwhile, there's a guy in Holland who's a billionaire who invented Deal or No Deal, which is basically a stupid idea about opening boxes, right? And he's got £1 billion. Yeah. Now, something's got to be done about intellectual property, where the guy who invents the Nat Show, who has created inordinate wealth, okay, all over the world, right? And he did get quite famous. I mean, in fairness, it wasn't as if he died before his contribution was acknowledged or anything like that. But there's no justice in the world, is there?
There's no justice, but there is utility, because there's a good reason why recipes aren't patentable, because you just have to imagine a world with millions of people saying, I invented the nacho. No, I invented something very like the nacho 2 weeks beforehand.
But how is that different from penicillin or pharmaceuticals?
Oh, the difference is that people are innovating in ways that are useful at scale, millions of times in every place every day, whereas someone comes up with a useful molecule very rarely, and these days can only put it on the market after they spend $1 billion jumping through more hoops than they should have.
No, I do have an interesting system psychological suggestion to intellectual property, by the way, which is that most people who have an interesting idea would be better off if lots of people could try out the idea to see where it was most applicable.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I also think that most people who have an idea patent it, not because they're frightened that someone else makes £100,000 out of it. Okay. They're frightened that someone makes 20 million. But if you had a system of patent where you said everybody's free to use this, okay, the only deal is if you make £100,000 out of it, if you make £500,000 out of it, that's yours to keep.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you make 10 million, it's payback time.
Yeah.
I think you would actually have vastly greater innovation, because loads of people could play around with these things at the early stages, and a few of them would get lucky. Because I actually think. By the way, I'm going to say something really outrageous here, but I think it's useful reframing. They always talk about the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
Okay, it wasn't just an industrial revolution; it was a marketing revolution, and nobody talks about that because the steam engines survive, but Chippendale's showroom or Josiah Wedgwood's marketing catalogues don't survive. But concomitant with the Industrial Revolution was actually people working out how to sell at scale, not just how to manufacture at scale. And we never talk about that second part of it. But I think without the marketing revolution, you would have just ended up with a load of bloody china piling up somewhere in a warehouse, right? But everybody Steve Jobs is a marketer, right? But everybody who's a successful marketer wants to rebrand themselves as an inventor. Because it's a higher status thing. And I think what we need to do is we need to reframe salesmanship. One great reason why the American economy is so robust, I think, is because they rather like the Japanese fundamentally venerate high quality manufacturing. I think the extent to which the Americans venerate salesmanship is actually hugely valuable.
Dan Pink's written a whole book on everyone being their own salesman. I think it's called "To Sell Is Human." I think that's what it's called.
A quick segue, just pure curiosity.
Of course.
If the US venerates salespersonship, shall we say, what does Australia and the UK venerate at the moment?
They put a salesman in the White House, right? I mean, the last election was: do you want to make president the head of sales or the head of HR, basically? There's a great article in The Atlantic, the HRification of the Democrat Party.
Yeah.
And they are a bit like the company's HR department, which is they're well-intentioned, but they're kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And they're not really on your side either.
Yeah.
That's the other thing about the Democrats and HR.
Yeah.
They pretend to be on your side, but don't really trust.
Yeah. So you haven't answered the question. You haven't answered.
Oh, sorry.
What does the UK and what does Australia venerate? And I'm assuming
we
they're
venerate
maybe not necessarily the same thing.
We venerate sporting excellence, and we produce a lot of it. We are, to my surprise, I've discovered Australian culture is less interested in ideas than British culture. I attribute.
Do you think? Whoa! Sorry. I don't doubt that in 1957 that was true.
No. Well, this is my great discovery. This is my great discovery.
I have a Dutch friend who always argues that the only problem about living in Holland is that the Dutch outsource interesting thinking to the Anglosphere.
Yeah.
To the the UK.
Yeah.
And he argues they get everything basically right, but they kind of outsource the interesting thinking.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that even though everybody in Holland speaks, my book Alchemy was translated into Dutch very early on, even though it's largely unnecessary to translate it for most Dutch people. It still hasn't been. It's been translated into Korean. It's been translated into traditional Chinese, Georgian. Okay, it still hasn't been translated into French, German, or Spanish. Okay, so there's a very weird way, by the way, in which this happens. It's very strange. But there's certain. But I think you're denigrating Australian thinking. I mean, likewise Canada. I think that I always occasionally people want to fly me out, and I go, but you've got really interesting marketing thinkers in Australia. Why do you need to import me? I genuinely don't think that's true. I find Australians incredibly interesting and
that's a different
and creative.
Thing. That's a different thing.
Okay.
Anyway, I won't try to.
Okay.
I won't try to defend it. I was going to say something else, but it's slipped my mind.
You didn't invent the flat white. Admittedly, that was the New Zealanders.
Was it?
Him up.
Was it? Well, we didn't invent.
Pure wine tap. Pure wine tap. Sorry, it's like pisco, which is variously invented in Peru or Chile, and if you get it wrong, they kill you. Basically, it's one of those weird sort of.
So, what's venerated in the UK at the moment?
That's an interesting question. The UK's sort of lost its way. I don't think it's got anything to do with Brexit. That would be the standard narrative. I would argue, by the way, that there's something, I'm going to talk about this because what I would do if I were the UK, is there is this body, this campaign called CANZUK, which basically means you should take Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK and basically have freedom of movement between them and, complete free trade.
It's an old idea. It's called imperial preferences.
Yeah, but I was thinking of it as a bit more kind of evenly spread. Okay, I wasn't suggesting that. However, if you think about it, if those countries were French-speaking, okay, the French wouldn't give a shit about the EU. If the president of the United States was called Jacques, okay, and the whole of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, for example, spoke French, the French wouldn't give a shit about Europe. Okay. And it does strike me as strange that you have four countries which are extraordinarily similar, always vote the same way at the United Nations, broadly speaking, have the same legal systems, the same language, and that no attempt is made at closer cooperation. I mean, apart from anything else, I mean, a majority of popular opinion in all four countries supports the idea. And by the way, I remember this. I partly had this idea because I spoke to someone in Ireland who said, and this is a very interesting thing, one thing that's interesting about the EU was what people didn't consider, okay, which is language. Now, bluntly put, lots and lots of people can go and work in an English-speaking country because they've already learned English, okay? If I moved to Warsaw, I'd be working as a street sweeper, effectively, okay? And in order to speak Polish well enough to get a job, I'd have to marry a Polish girl and, spend 5 years there. Whereas people through exposure to the English language and the incentive to learn English, in the other direction, it's completely asymmetrical. And someone in Ireland came up to him once and said, they keep telling me that, we're at the heart of Europe. He said, it's a load of bollocks. He said, anybody who leaves Ireland, he said, they never go to continental Europe. They go to the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the UK, right? And if you look at patterns of movement, there are more Britons working in Australia than if you exclude Ireland, there are more British people working in Australia. I'm not including retirees who go to Spain and sit by a pool and stuff, right? There are more Britons working in Australia at the moment than there are working in the whole of the EU. The population of Perth is 1/8 British born, okay? And also, it's not as if it's also fairly equitable because for reasons I don't fully understand, lots of Australians seem to want to come to Britain, which makes no sense to me at all. if it weren't if it weren't for my commitments to sort of family and so forth, I'd be out there in the shop.
Oh, well, that's also true. That's also true. Lots of people come here and stay.
Yeah. But no, I mean, it always strikes me as interesting because it strikes me as one of those ideas which never gets considered almost because it's too obvious. I mean, what's the obstacle to such an obvious idea?
Well, there's a new obstacle, which is called Donald Trump. But
I thought that's an opportunity, really, that the Canadians.
Well, not if he's imposing.
Need a few new mates.
Yes, but not if he's imposing tariffs on Canadians.
I'm not a Trump apologist.
Yeah.
But this is like, right, Donald Trump's behaviour is like moving into a house and you've got like a really easygoing vicar living next door and you suddenly do everything you can to piss them off.
Yeah, that's right.
It makes no sense, okay? Of all the neighbours you could seek to have, okay?
Yeah, that's right.
So the question, what is revered in the UK? What do you reckon?
In fairness, I would give it high marks, generally high marks, as a place with a reasonable appetite for creativity and innovation still. The level of inventiveness. I'd also make the point, I don't know if this is also true, I think it's also true in Australia, although Gen Z are widely kind of denigrated, I find the younger generation of people extraordinarily impressive, actually.
Mm. Yep, so do I.
You'd say the same thing?
I would, yeah. Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually broadly impressive too, in that they seem to have high levels of curiosity. I mean, we've never talked about this, but YouTube must help enormously, mustn't it? And actually, it suddenly occurs to me there's so much information which we never realised when we had linear TV, which is kind of time and mood or context specific. And okay, so YouTube is a brilliant thing because the kind of single issue obsessives who make appalling companions in a pub, the kind of people who would only talk about Deltic railway locomotives, okay, they'd be unbelievably tedious as pub companions. You say, can we talk about something else?
Are you talking about the Instagrammer in the UK who was the fishbowl camera?
Bourgeois, fantastic guy. Okay, trade obsessive.
He's brilliant.
And so people with mild Asperger's or ADHD who might find it difficult to function in the real world become spectacularly valuable in a world where you have content on demand. So I always joke about this, which is, I think there's something like 100 million hours of footage on YouTube where the subject line starts with how to.
Yeah, there's a lot of it.
And if your boiler breaks down or you need to I just needed to reset my air filter upstairs, okay? Someone's made a film about how to do it.
Yeah.
The film I actually watched that told me how to do it was actually in Hindi, but I could watch closely enough to understand what the guy was doing.
So AI is going to in my life, AI has now disintermediated a lot of that. So I now ask AI, I say I'm on a I've got Sennheiser earbuds and I can't get them to connect up with my Android, and it's incredible.
But it just strikes me as what's so funny is you have these moments of footage like how to repair your boiler, which would literally be the worst television in the world.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good point.
Until you need to repair your boiler.
Right. Yeah. Switch of frame. Exactly right.
Switch of frame. Right. And it's better than Hitchcock.
Well, let me say something quite serious. The thing about AI is one of the things that AI is teaching us is that facts are not facts, that our relationship with the world is a question asking and getting answers relationship. It isn't that there's a model of the world in our heads and we're after maximum correspondence with the world.
No.
It's we want to there's this world out there that is just an immensity in every direction, and we have this need to ask it questions, get it to do things for us, work out what we can do and what we can't do. And AI is helping people see the reality of that. Whereas that idea, was much harder to explain before. I think that will become a much more fundamental idea.
I mean, it's probabilistic, not deterministic, which is important, isn't it? Which is the only way you can, But the other thing I think is that I think AI will only reach its full fruition when the AI people read the work of people like Ian McGilchrist.
Why?
Because it seems interesting to me, the fact that the brains of virtually all sophisticated living moving animals are split into two.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And that they perform the same task.
Yeah.
Worms.
Yeah.
Okay, and the fact that they perform the same task but in complementary ways, with a kind of conversation between the hemispheres, if you want to call it that.
Totally agree.
And the fact that you need to have one part which is reductionist and another part which is kind of expansionist. And I think it comes down to that thing in algorithm design and animal foraging, the explore-exploit trade-off. Okay? That fundamentally you have this, and it's not a trade-off, by the way. You taught me that, because it's always called a trade-off. The resources you spend discovering and the resources you spend exploiting what you've discovered.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not a trade-off. It's actually a benign. Someone with an Eastern mindset, familiar with yin and yang, would see that as the unity of opposites.
Yes.
That you need to exploit to fund exploration, but you need to explore to direct exploitation.
Yeah.
So the idea that there's a trade-off between the two is fundamentally erroneous in the way of looking at it.
And is that not a way of thinking of things like a system?
Yes. You're probably right that actually it's a reframing of the thing as a whole rather than as...
Sure.
So Ian McGilchrist's point would be that the non-systems thinker, see what I mean, would just reduce something into its component parts.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep, agree with that.
And the capacity of the right brain is to see something holistically in its entirety, using, in many ways, probably looking at things that are actually incommensurable as well. And this always interests me in the difference between consumer decision-making and business-to-business decision-making. Because your wife, when she buys something, can use heuristics like you get what you pay for, right? Okay? Which is not a bad heuristic, actually.
No.
Okay? Because after all, if something's been on the market for a while at a higher price, it probably means that, you're using social intelligence there through the price mechanism, etc., etc. There's also weird shit, by the way, which is a lot of high spending is driven for anthropological reasons to mark an occasion, not for utility. So Joe Fattorini, great wine expert, makes this point that people spend more on wine because they want to show hospitality, show generosity, or mark an occasion. It's not really about the wine. Okay, it's about saying this is special, and so I always ask. It doesn't really work for men, but for women, if your best friend gets married, you could actually go to ASOS and buy a £15 dress, and unless it's Anna Wintour's wedding, no one's going to really know, right? But you don't. You go and spend $400 or something at Rixo because the occasion just requires it, and so. My article in The Spectator today is about a proposed Veblen added tax. Where I've
heard you tell me this part. This is great. Go on.
Okay, so the suggestion is there are certain forms of consumption which are massively socially beneficial, right? I don't think pubs should be taxed at all. Because when you fund a pub, when you go to a pub, you're funding a social space, aren't you? Your presence there adds to the general merriment, okay? And when you've left the pub, your buying beer has funded the existence of a pub for other people to use after you've left. Okay, so you're undoubtedly creating a social benefit, every bit as much as if your taxes fund a leisure centre or something, library or something boring like that, right? Okay, so pubs shouldn't be taxed. On the other hand, luxury goods should be taxed because they're rivalrous. They're consumed to get one up on somebody else. This is Robert Frank.
Well,
okay.
it's
so my suggestion is, for example,
positional goods. Positional goods.
That's so Indian restaurants.
Henry George goes back to the turn.
And Veblen. Yeah.
Ah, When you said
the position-
Veblen, I was thinking, what did Weber have to say about this?
No, sorry, no.
Veblen. Yeah, sorry. That's good.
I mean, Georgism is undoubtedly true because the purchase of property is rivalrous.
Yeah.
You're excluding someone else. You're paying for the right to exclude someone else.
Yeah.
When you fund a pub, you're adding to the... I think the guy who got economics right was de Mandeville, actually. I thought he basically nailed the whole thing. Yeah.
So what did he say? What did he say?
Bernard de Mandeville was public vices... What was it? Private vices, public benefits. Okay.
Public virtues, yeah. Private vices, public virtues. Yeah.
Private vices, public virtues. Okay. And I mean, actually, Adam Smith basically got the idea from Mandeville to a large extent, I think.
He was trying to make the world safe for Mandeville, basically. He was dressing it up.
But if you literally had a world where... So one of my suggestions is, Greggs and Indian restaurants, 0% Veblen added tax, because they're intrinsic goods, right? An Indian restaurant, right? There's no social signalling value. It's pure enjoyment, right? Italian restaurants, 5 to 10%. French restaurants, 100%. Right?
We will get you to explain all this, Rory, and I'm sure everyone will just quickly agree, and there'll be no problem.
But it is good. I think it works. The more intrinsic something is, it's subjective. I agree. Right. And in France, that system would probably have to be changed, obviously.
I think so.
But no. I mean, I think I think there's some very interesting stuff. I think what's so interesting about economics, by the way, is that. If you said we're going to take a systems approach, now the current sort of very lazy economic approach is undoubtedly a system, but it's unbelievably crude. And what's significant, I think, is the attempts to improve it are more interesting than the attempts to practice it. In other words, most interesting work out of economics emerges from trying to correct the errors of the existing model. Mm-hmm. I described it to the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. I said following economics is like following a Formula One team that has a shit driver, a terrible car, but a brilliant pit crew.
Yeah.
Because all the all the interesting activity is in the attempts to repair it.
Yes. Very much so. Very much. I like that.
Okay. So, I mean, Austrian, Georgian, and you look at all the distant schools of economics and you go, hold on. There's a lot here which everybody else is missing, okay? And you go to conventional economics and you go, there's a lot here which everybody is over-focused on.
Yeah, well, that's true. No question.
I am loath to even attempt to bring this to a close, but I'm immensely enjoying listening to both of you. But can we have some closing thoughts on the original argument on systems thinking versus not systems thinking?
I think it's yeah, go on, sorry.
Oh, well, are you actually saying the same thing and maybe even joined with a common dislike for people who bandy the word systems around but actually don't take an approach consistent with it?
I think that Rory has shown that I'm wrong and that the only arguments that have been produced in my favour are paradoxically from Rory. So...
like what? Explain.
Well, okay. I think we've heard many examples of many things from Rory, and I don't think there's a single one that is an example where which came from the reframing of this is a complex system. This is a complex system is an ex post rationalization. And where the insights are coming from is from the attempt to notice the dissatisfaction with the way things are being described. We just had an extremely good example with the way things are described by modern economics. It just leaves out vast amounts of the world, some of which could be useful in trying to make it better. So that's what thinking is, almost always. And this thing about systems thinking is kind of an artifact of of our love of the conclusion without bothering with the reasoning to get there. And the reasoning to get there is not systems thinking, it's noticing, building,
Yes.
trying things out, and trying
This is what Nassim calls stochastic tinkering.
Yes, nice.
And I think where you're absolutely right is that what a lot of systems thinking is trying to do is trying to replace one system with another system.
Yes, exactly.
Which is absolutely fine if the inputs are completely stable and controlled,
they
and you
never
want
are.
a repeated output.
Yeah.
I mean, they can. You could argue in a production line,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
a high degree of systematization is good. In an advertising agency, a high degree of systematization of any kind actually is dubious, because what you're really doing is waiting to get lucky. And I think the really important thing about that is that there are a lot of things which you can never sell in a business context because the finance department always demand complete predictability. Okay, but the trouble is there's no data about the future. Okay, so if you want to do something significant in the future, you have to do you have to place a bet, and you have to basically just maximize. Nassim Taleb calls this increasing your surface area exposure to positive upside optionality. Okay, and I think that's what cops are doing actually instinctively. Well, did you notice anything unusual?
It's the opposite of what politicians and spokespeople do, which is to minimise surface area of attack surfaces.
Yes, absolutely beautiful. Agreed. That's beautiful. We should put that in so. In other words, you're minimising your surface area because surface area exposes you to attack.
Exactly.
Now, this is, of course, very interesting in terms of the nature of fame, because I've accidentally become famous.
Yes, I know.
Okay, through TikTok.
Yeah.
Now, the benefit is not that it helps you achieve
Sean, I've followed this man around Kilkenny in Ireland, and I can tell you he gets stopped.
At Kilkenomics.
Yeah.
Selfies.
Yeah. You get yourself.
But the really interesting thing about being famous, and I don't think our advertising clients understand this, it's not that being famous helps you achieve what you wanted to achieve all along, but more so.
Yeah.
It's that it brings you opportunities that you never even were aware existed.
Yes.
Because it changes the direction of travel.
Yeah.
In other words, businesses who I've never heard of come to me and say, can you help us solve this problem, which I've never even envisaged? Okay, and that's how fame works. Now, interestingly, if you're paranoid about reputation, you seek to minimise fame because, of course, it's a source of vulnerability.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm now coming back to agreeing with Nick by saying that a lot of systems thinking is actually attempting simply to improve a system where what we actually need is maximising opportunity.
Yeah, that's right.
And we know how to do that. We don't know how it's going to pay off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I would argue that's why a company should advertise. They shouldn't advertise to achieve an objective they've already defined.
Yeah.
They should advertise to discover possibilities they've never even envisaged.
Killer apps.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I could honestly continue this all night with you guys. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful chat. Thank you.